it's generally been the case, and you can look back to the days of Hugh Carlton-Green as Director General in the 1960s, that the BBC has had a broad left-wing flavour, liberal flavour, I think is probably fairer to say. But it's awareness of that that is the issue.
What they've taken from this is that they need to basically dumb down,
yes,
like unbelievably good-looking, has an era-defining rack.
Yes. I'm trying very, very hard to be absolutely fair and balanced, because my application to be Director General of the BBC is under active consideration at the moment, and I want to demonstrate that I can bring masterly objectivity to current affairs even where my own interests are directly engaged. Welcome to Quite Right. I'm Michael Gove, editor of The Spectator.
And I'm Madeline Grant, assistant editor and parliamentary sketch writer at The Spectator.
And this week we'll be discussing the crisis at the BBC. Yeah, I know journalists love talking about other journalists. So Maddie and I will be looking at what the future may hold for the BBC. And we'll also be considering changes in education. And the week that Ofsted introduce a new inspection regime, we'll be asking whether or not this contributes to the further tragic Bridget Philistination of our curriculum.
And finally, we will be discussing that viral interview with actress Sydney Sweeney. And does this spell the end of woke in Hollywood?
The future of the BBC is the focus of interest, not just in Whitehall and Westminster, but across the country, following the resignation of the Director General, Tim Davie, and the Head of News and Current Affairs, Deborah Turness. Both of them resigned at the weekend following the criticisms that have been directed at the corporation over essentially bias. A memo drawn up by an outside advisor, Michael Prescott, and which had been compiled by a BBC staffer, David Grossman, drew attention to a number of areas of bias which gave rise to concern. The most prominent of which was the panorama which ran or aired just before the presidential election, which spliced together different bits of a speech that Donald Trump gave on January the 6th, the day of the alleged insurrection against the Capitol.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and I'll be there with you, and we fight. We fight like hell. We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women.
And the nature of that deliberate yoking together of disparate parts of his speech has been the focus, but actually the memo pointed to a number of areas of concern. Tim Davie has had to deal with a number of complaints against the BBC, everything from the handling of Greg Wallace's behaviour on MasterChef through to the airing of Bob Villan's comments on the IDF at Glastonbury, through to the handling of Hugh Edwards and the scandal, disgrace, and then subsequent failure by the BBC effectively perhaps to deal with that. So in a way, that's the culmination of a number of high-profile scandals. But what I think is more fascinating, Maddie, is the way in which so much of the debate around Davie, Turness, and the future of the BBC has seen people gravitate towards different poles, perhaps rather than address the substance of the critique that had been mounted.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The reaction has been so interesting from supporters of the BBC, with some notable exceptions. You know, there are people who are vested in the BBC's future and are quite aghast about what has been revealed here, who want the corporation to succeed, who have been doing kind of, I suppose, useful, friendly advice from the sidelines. But the reaction overwhelmingly seems to have been either a kind of nothing to see here, folks, or it has been active self-congratulation, lots of supporters talking only about the things that the BBC does well, as if the memo never happened. And then you have the kind of NPC response, like Ed Davie
yes.
writing to Starmer and Badenoch and saying, what did he say? This must be a chance for the BBC to turn a new leaf, rebuild trust, and not give in to those like Nigel Farage who want to destroy the BBC. We must stand up for a strong, independent BBC to stop Trump's America becoming Farage's Britain. I mean, I'm not sure that if you're, with friends like these, who needs enemies? If you want to keep the BBC surviving the next few decades at least, the last thing he should be doing is going around suggesting that the national broadcaster's raison d'etre is to basically counter populism, which is what he seems to be suggesting. And then, of course, there's that very familiar, weary defence, which is that if Trump, Putin and the Tory right are all angry with the BBC, then it must be doing something right.
Yes.
You know, it's a real failure to engage with the criticism. Even Panorama seems to be has kind of leaked out that they feel that they are being scapegoated for every failing at the BBC, and what they did wasn't actually that bad. When I think to most fair-minded observers, it is objectively like very obvious fake news of the kind that the BBC is otherwise engaged in the business of trying to counter, or says it is.
You've had some people, friends of the BBC, I'm not sure that they're necessarily the friends the BBC needs, saying that it doesn't really matter that they completely distorted what Trump actually said on the day, because January the 6th would never have happened, the insurrection would never have happened without Trump's incitement.
And it was true in spirit, you know.
Exactly. And so this is what in the police would be called noble cause corruption. We know he's a bad un. So it doesn't matter that we manufactured the evidence because he's a villain and he deserves to go down. You can't operate on that way journalistically, particularly not if you're the BBC. And it's also the case that defenders of the BBC have tried different things. They're aware that the BBC's heritage, going back, of course, to its foundation, going back to the Second World War, when it was London calling to occupied Europe and it was the voice of freedom, and going back to the legacy of civilization, life on Earth, and its amazing back catalogue, and saying those who are attempting to burn it down are false friends of small c conservative Britain. They're wreckers, not true conservatives. And added to that, you also have in Ed Davie someone who thinks, actually, do you know what? This is a culture war in which I, as the leader of the Lib Dems, can play a particular role, playing to the sense of small L liberal Middle England, that these horrific encroaching populists are going to tear something down that we all cherish. So you have those two things coming together, the heritage of the BBC and those who are attempting, for their own reasons, to weaponize it. And what both of those things miss is that the critique of the BBC's approach in news and current affairs was written by someone who's a serving BBC journalist, and it came from a place of concern about the BBC's authority.
This is a very important point. I've seen people also trying to cast aspersions on Michael Prescott himself and why he might have done this. But if you actually read the memo, to me it reads like someone who is a long-time BBC man, or rather a friend of the BBC, who looks at some of these flagrant examples of bias, omission and signs of worrying ideological capture. And he says, this is not the way that we've traditionally done things. We need to get back. It's vitally important that we get back to that way of doing things. Otherwise, there will not be a BBC. It comes from a place of concern and also wanting the organisation to survive. It
went on, the memo in question, to list examples of a gullibility when it came to claims about institutional racism, to capture by trans activists of the whole question of discussions of gender.
Yeah.
And I think most damningly, it looked at BBC Arabic, which is the news service that, of course, goes to millions across the Middle East, where the approach towards reporting the conflict between Israel and Hamas was not just one-sided, but tendentious and propagandist on behalf of the Hamas side. So it was a pretty sweeping critique.
It was.
And the fact that so many of the BBC's defenders, or would-be defenders, have just concentrated on one area, which is Trump, where they think that they can say, look, You're either with Trump or the BBC.
Yes. And
misses the point.
Well, it's a clever gambit, because in a choice between Trump and the BBC in a culture war, the nation will probably choose the BBC.
Yes.
But I think it's wrong. It's the comfort zone, but it will ultimately lead them to ruin if they don't listen to what their detractors are saying. And some of these detractors, by the way, are people like Mark Urban and Joe Coburn, people who very much do want the corporation to succeed. But one of the pictures the memo for me paints as well, which is a problem I think applies to many institutions in Britain right now, is kind of relating to what Prescott says about in particular, the ideological capture with reporting on gender identity and sex. Is that you basically have a pool of reporters who deal with any reporting that has to do with LGBT rights. And this pool of reporters basically dominates coverage of that issue, which is obviously a very important issue, but one in which received wisdom, or rather not received wisdom, but the kind of consensus amongst politicians changed very rapidly, in part because of the campaigning of women and activists, feminist activists, is an area where the BBC has really been left behind in a big way because of this capture. It seems to me that this leaves them like asleep at the wheel on many big stories. There are some honourable exceptions. At Newsnight, Hannah Barnes did some fantastic reporting on the Tavistock Clinic. But I wonder if in the climate described in this memo now, she would have been allowed to do that. And it's notable that she too has now left the BBC and is at the New Statesman.
Quite.
You know, like how many excellent people at the BBC are either have already left or seem to be quite unhappy and are perhaps in the process of leaving.
And the institutional capture that you mentioned by one particular perspective on the whole question of sex and gender is not restricted to the BBC. If you talk to, for example, anyone in publishing, they will make the point that it's often younger staffers who will exercise a form of not-so-soft censorship of particular views and perspectives. And, of course, we've seen on campus the campaign against Kathleen Stock as a gender-critical feminist. But at the BBC, it seems to have been particularly acute. And it doesn't seem to have gone away.
No.
Because Martine Croxall, who's a presenter on the BBC News channel, quite rightly and factually pointed out that the script that she'd been given, which referred to pregnant people, should actually refer to pregnant women.
Oh, my God.
And yet she was censured and criticised by the BBC's own hierarchy for expressing a view, when in fact she was merely standing up for scientific truth and accuracy.
They also said that it wasn't the thing that she had said, but it was the fact that she visibly kind of scoffs or rolls her eyes at that moment. So they tried to reprimand her based on a facial expression, which seems to be taking things in a very extreme direction, especially when the thing that she was scoffing at was basically an extremely fringe and radical viewpoint that only a very small minority of British people subscribe to. Surely the BBC should not have that as the kind of house style. And if someone scoffs at that being the house style, then maybe they should, they should back the person that did the scoffing, because that's far more representative of what the BBC would traditionally have done,
Completely. And I worked at the BBC many years ago. I worked on the Today programme for about 18 months when it was edited by, to my mind, one of the best BBC journalists ever, Roger Mosey. And I also worked alongside people like Jonathan Maitland and Jeremy Vine and others who've gone on to broadcasting eminence, and indeed our own Rod Little, who's an assistant editor on the Today programme at the time. And I'm not going to go back into, in my day, nostalgia-ism, but I do think that it's generally been the case, and you can look back to the days of Hugh Carlton-Green as Director General in the 1960s, that the BBC has had a broad left-wing flavour, liberal flavour, I think it's probably fairer to say. And way back in the 70s when Ian MacLeod, 60s, 70s, when Ian MacLeod was a leading Conservative figure, Chancellor of the Exchequer briefly, many of his colleagues complained about the BBC at the time. He made the point that if you were to take 10 graduates from university, the 5 who would be on the right would tend to go into finance, law and the professions. The 5 on the left would tend to go into academia and broadcasting. So it was a reflection of it. And I think one has to recognise that and be mature. But it's awareness of that that is the issue. It's the knowledge
It's
that
a restraint that needs to happen to create good programming.
And what has been absent in the comments from a number of people seeking to defend the BBC is that point. So some ex-BBC presenters were saying, well, all the time that I was there, the pressure always came from the right, and there were editors who were always saying, can you imagine what a Conservative might think of this? We never had any pressure to ask ourselves, what would Zach Polanski think of this? What would Jeremy Corbyn think of this? And so on.
Yeah.
What I think that misses is that the left view, not on every issue, but on many issues, would be regarded as the default position by many within the BBC. And those who were saying, well, not quite check your privilege, but guard against your prejudice, are now being depicted as plotters and destroyers. And you've seen this focus particularly on someone, let me declare an interest, a friend of mine called Robbie Gibb, who used to be a BBC editor, then became Theresa May's chief press spokesman, and is now on the board of the BBC. And he has been singled out as the demon king of this whole thing, the MAGA agent at the heart of the Beeb. But all that he's been doing, as someone who is a avowed defender of the licence fee and a strong partisan for the BBC, is saying that the BBC's future depends on an acknowledgement of these errors, not just a perfunctory, we got it wrong anyway, never mind, but a deeper reflection on why these things are systemic.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the point about the intergenerational difference that you mentioned is very important. And also, it's not exclusively a problem for the BBC. I'm often surprised by particularly younger anchors and correspondents at some of the other news channels will often be very explicit on social media about what they think. They will ask extremely leading questions of the Cathy Newman, Jordan Peterson variety, and just generally showing a lack of, because to keep your own opinions hidden, and I know it's a bit pot kettle for me to be saying this because I'm extremely open about my opinions, but there's a big difference between the rules that broadcasters subscribe to and people like me who deal in opinion, and that is factored into how people will engage with my content. It takes self-discipline to sort of repress your own personal opinion and your personality. But historically, that is what led to fantastic programming.
Yes.
It led to these presenters that didn't put their hand on the scales all the time. And also, I think it shows a certain level of respect for the audience because it says, we're not going to tell you what to think. We're going to just present things in a fairly impartial way and allow you to join the dots and make up your own mind. But I think there is now a kind of activist journalism which basically says that there are issues such as Donald Trump on which we can no longer be silent, that we have to take a stand morally. Similarly with climate change. And I think that there's been a question about whether they should give a platform to people that deny man-made climate change, which is like, fine, that's one thing. But I think that has often bled into, we go full Greta without questioning, the orthodoxy, even though there are some very respectable, sophisticated thinkers that have questioned the orthodoxy. But, the thing that I just come back to again and again is, I know you said, let's not get too nostalgic, but I'm going to get nostalgic because I remember...
You're allowed to.
Okay, I don't know if I'm allowed to. I think I'm probably, a bit young fogish to be getting nostalgic. But I remember what the BBC used to be like. I do. Growing up in the 90s, noughties, I was very interested in history. Every time you could just go on BBC4 or any BBC channel and there would be probably a very interesting, well-made documentary about an area of particular historical period. They would pump out these constantly, very much fulfilling the Reithian point about educating as well as entertaining. And then there was news conveyed with little fanfare or editorialising. And this performed a really valuable public service. But I think there are many on the right, actually, who perhaps don't just want to dismantle the BBC, but perhaps see a sort of a purpose to it. But to me, it's basically nostalgic. The BBC hasn't resembled this for some years.
The cultural confidence, which I suspect, actually, one would want to see in other institutions, is absent as well. So the notion that there is high culture, that towards which one should aspire hasn't been as strongly asserted as it might have been.
No.
And it's part of a broader sense of insecurity, relativism, and acceptance of the relativist and declinist critique that afflicts so many institutions.
Absolutely. And also, I think a misguided attempt to try and bring younger viewers with them.
Yes.
You know, they look at the data that suggests that younger viewers are not tuning into the BBC or indeed to much mainstream broadcasting. Generally, young people get their news and information overwhelmingly from social media, and YouTube has taken off, etc. You know, a massive way in the last 20 years or so. You know, these are very difficult forces for the BBC to contend with. But I think what they've taken from this is that they need to basically dumb down, pander, and actually that doesn't attract the young people, because I think they can sense when they're being patronised and they're given kind of like cool youth kind of stuff like that. And at the same time, it alienates the core older audience who feel correctly that they are being patronised.
And there is a direct analogy, I think, tell me if you think I'm wrong, with, fun enough, what's happened with the Church of England and even the military. So it's perhaps an overworked trope, but it is still true that the quiet revival that we've both observed and the magazine has observed in the church has been led by those who opt for a traditional liturgy, for excellent music, and for intellectually challenging sermons or homilies, and that an attempt to go down the route that Canterbury Cathedral went down, and to think that graffiti, electric guitars, and the lowest common denominator approach towards faith is going to attract young people. That's been decisively proven to be wrong.
Yes.
Trad wins, mod loses.
Yes.
And briefly, just on the army, the Deputy Chief of the General Staff, as we reported, explained to officers just last week or a fortnight ago that it was a strategic necessity for the defence of the realm that army officers did not cross the threshold of private members' clubs that had different facilities for women.
Oh my
now,
God.
The key
England
thing
expects that every they them will do his duty.
But the key thing there is the whole point of our military is that their job is to be a band of brothers determined to go out and to kill the king's enemies. They are not there to conform to a Harmonesque model of a DEI good practice.
Yeah.
And in all three cases, my fear is that institutions that succeed by having at their heart something which is deliberately saying to the dumbers down, the relativizers, and to the advocates of accessibility, these institutions depend on saying no.
Yeah.
Something worthwhile demands a degree of effort. And so the whole point about being a soldier is warrior culture. The whole point about the church is that it makes demands even as it provides comfort. And the whole point of culture, certainly as the BBC should carry it forward, and this is part of the justification for the licence fee, is the market doesn't provide it.
Yeah.
But we regard it as worthy of not just your attention, but your respect. And I'm not sure that there are a sufficient number of people in the BBC who cleave to that. So it's not just about political balance. It's also about a certain idea of what culture means. When Andrew Roberts is presenting the Today programme and Nigel Biggar is doing Thought for the Day every day, then we'll know that the right level of ambition has been reached. But I suppose, in a way, one of the people that we should blame for this situation is whoever was Education Secretary in the past. And in a suitable spirit of self-reflection, after the break, we will be discussing the state of British or English education.
This week has seen some significant changes in the way that we inspect and grade our schools. Schools will no longer from this week be given single-word judgments from Ofsted, but will instead be graded in a so-called report card system, which assesses various areas such as quality of education, behaviour and leadership. Ofsted made these changes following the tragic suicide of a headmistress, Ruth Perry, who took her own life following an inspection in 2023. Michael, firstly, I wanted to ask, what do you make of this particular change to Ofsted? Is it the right change at the right time, or is it going to lead to perhaps lower rigour than we would have had otherwise?
It's a definitive backward step. I before the break said that I'd be reflective, and I shall be, because I don't think that when I was Education Secretary, I was energetic enough in saying how much standards needed to be raised and how much more rigorous we needed to be. And I know that when I was Education Secretary, I inspired all sorts of opposition and criticism, fury and contumely. But what this, I think, demonstrates is that left to its own devices, the educational system will gravitate towards an evasion of responsibility for aiming as high as possible. And the dilution of the clarity of Ofsted's judgments is part of that. It means that accountability is less sharp. To be fair, or actually to be accurate, the one-word judgments reflected, as any parent knows, a very detailed report. It was simply a summation, but a very helpful summation of the work that inspectors did that was laid out in the full report and which was there for everyone to see. But any attempt to obfuscate or to emulsify the discourse in this way is a way of moving away from confronting uncomfortable truths, and one of the uncomfortable truths is there are still too many underperforming schools and underperforming teachers, and the people who suffer most are the poorest in our society.
I have to say, I felt a bit uncomfortable about the way in which this change to the system occurred. For example, the charity Samaritans, which deals with suicide and tries to talk suicidal people out of taking their own lives, they advise that it's unhealthy and wrong to attribute someone's suicide to one particular cause.
Yes.
However, the media narrative around the suicide of Ruth Perry was basically that it was entirely because of the Ofsted inspection, and that the Ofsted inspection was therefore a kind of evil process that was dangerous to all teachers and all particularly heads, and should therefore be changed. But this goes against the advice that journalists are given, for example, on how to report a suicide. But it felt like that all of that established viewpoint could basically be disturbed if it was making the right political point.
It is absolutely correct to say that you should never attribute suicide to simply one cause. You should never say X committed suicide because of Y. It's not just Samaritans, it's every mental health professional worth their qualification would say that there is never a single factor, that the decision that an individual might take to take their own life will come against a backdrop of mental illness or mental unease or mental unsettlement, where a factor might act as a trigger or a provocation or a moment. But to say that a single adverse event, in particular a single professional event, drove someone to commit suicide is a misunderstanding of the nature of the tragedy, but B, in this case, I think it is a wicked appropriation of this tragedy in order to advance a particular agenda, and that agenda, as it happens, will harm children by making sure that there is a less effective focus on school performance. It should also be said that the reason why Ruth Perry's school was judged inadequate relates to a decision that politicians had made, which was to say that if a school failed in one particular aspect of inspection, safeguarding, keeping children safe, then it would fail overall. It was what was called a limiting judgment. So this wasn't an Ofsted fault. It was a political decision. And the proper debate should be, and to be fair, there has been focused debate on this and change. Should it be the case that if a school is found not to meet safeguarding requirements in one area, should it be considered inadequate overall? But it's also the case that the broad safeguarding culture that exists in our schools has been a response to, public and media pressure to elevate that above other considerations, and a worthwhile debate about whether or not safeguarding and the box ticking that goes along with it has gone too far. I think that is absolutely a legitimate area for debate. But the retreat on Ofsted, I'm afraid, is yet another example, along with last week's decision by the Education Secretary to move away from the more rigorous measure of progress at GCSE, Progress 8. It's another example of a retreat from the accountability that may be uncomfortable at times for teachers, but is necessary for students.
There does appear to be a particular direction of travel. Do you think it's exclusively coming from Bridget Philistine herself and her team? Or, is it also possible that there's maybe a lack of direction in the department, and in absence of other ideas, they're just doing whatever they're told by the teaching unions?
I think it's overall the case that unless you are very determined to the point of obstinacy to resist the gravitational pull of the educational system, the educational establishment, is always towards settling for second or third best and not for a higher level of ambition. Now, I'm going to surprise you, I suspect, and maybe discomfort listeners by actually saying that Bridget Philistine has done one or two good things.
Oh, really? What are they?
So I think that she has actually correctly said that triple science, i.e. studying science at GCSE as separate subjects, physics, chemistry and biology, rather than a portmanteau double science where you get slightly less of, in fact, significantly less of each subject together. That is a higher level of ambition, and in saying that that should be available in every school, because there are 10% of schools where it's not available at all, she is absolutely right. And also, the curriculum review, while a number of things in it that I don't think move us in the right direction, it does affirm the importance of a knowledge-rich curriculum, and it does confirm that school standards have risen over the last couple of decades, and Bridget Philistine has accepted that, even if only tacitly. So those are two good things. One, a slightly higher level of ambition in science, and two, an act of forbearance on her part in not being, what's the word?
Entirely dismissive of the legacy that she inherited.
Precisely. I'm trying very, very hard to be absolutely fair and balanced, because my application to be Director General of the BBC is under active consideration at the moment, and I want to demonstrate that I can bring masterly objectivity to current affairs, even where my own interests are directly engaged. But so that, that is fair. However, your point is absolutely on it, because it's in the interests of the trade unions to want to hide poor performance on the part of their members. It's in the interests of weak heads to want to avoid scrutiny. It's in the the passing interests of the government of the day to say that standards are improving even if they're not.
Yeah.
And it sometimes appears to be in the interests of the student or the parent at the time to say, hooray, haven't we done well? Even when the qualification itself is not as demanding as it might be. And some of the strongest opposition that I faced as Education Secretary is when I said, let's have more content in the history curriculum. And people said, no, that's outrageous. You're asking people to know too much. And then when I said, let's fix the GCSE or have the GCSE at the same equivalent as the O-level, which still exists in Singapore, in one of the highest performing educational jurisdictions. The challenge for this Labour government is that the New Labour, and I know New Labour did all sorts of terrible things, but the New Labour belief that you could only have a progressive government if it had an aspirational message.
Yes.
Sometimes that message was more honoured in the breach than the observance, but it was still there. That seems to be missing in this government, in that the whole atmosphere of the early Blair years was, yes, this is a progressive administration, this is a young country, blah, blah, blah. But it was also the case that they
Young
believed...
country, indeed. It's the oldest country in the world.
Precisely. So there was a lot of efflatus and nonsense. But there was a belief that when it came to public services, that they needed to improve and that people had a right to demand improvement. And critically, Blair argued that unless you can see schools improving, unless you have middle-class parents believing that the state system will work, the whole thing will fall apart. And poorer students will be those who suffer most.
Yeah.
And you don't seem to have anything like the same level of ambition, either for working-class children or for children overall, being expressed in the policies that the government brings forward.
The thing I get from Bridget Philistine overall is a genuine feeling that she is motivated by spite. I don't get the impression that she is that interested in raising standards for all. In particular, there seems to be a real fixation with... Firstly, I think there is a dumbing down going on. I mean, in my sketches, I've been nicknaming her Bridget Philistine because I think that is the direction of travel. She's obsessed with anything that even has the trappings of elitism. For example, she pulled the plug on the state school Latin programme that was delivering Latin to, I think, 40 deprived schools. And she callously pulled the plug on that midway through the school year.
Yes.
So leaving students who in good faith had begun their studies unable to complete them in some cases, and also at the saving of a paltry 1 million, which I know is like a vast sum of money, but in this grand scheme of government spending is a pittance.
Spot on.
Why would you do that if it wasn't a sense that Latin is for posh kids? I don't want that to be infesting the state school programme.
It's ironic, if that's the right adjective, that not only has she contributed to the collapse of Latin in state schools, even as it was growing, but she's also withdrawn money for the international baccalaureate being taught in state schools. It was only taught in a small number, but it was the case that...
It was a start.
It was a start. And Blair argued that there should be an international baccalaureate school in every major town or city in order to have choice and diversity. But then on top of that, the changes that she's made to the way in which GCSE league tables work will inevitably mean, everyone acknowledges this, a further decline in the number of students studying modern foreign languages. So she will have made this country more insular. And it might seem, I can hear the the usual sort of lefty critics saying, Brexit, go, blah 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 blah, crocodile tears. But learning foreign languages is...
Well, in that case, we should be learning from farther afield than Europe, where the education is best in the
But
Far
learning
East.
foreign languages is not just a joy in itself. It is also the case, without wanting to be too techie, that scientists who've studied the brain and cognitive growth have pointed out that it is literally the case that parts of the brain fire up, neural synapses are connected and start working as a result of learning foreign languages that don't if you don't. And I think there was some research this week, I've no idea how robust it is, that said that actually the more foreign languages you know, the longer you live.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not suggesting that Bridget Philistine is, by getting foreign languages marginalised in our schools, contributing to some sort of Logan's Run style.
We're all going to die.
Process.
My French is not going to take me very far.
No, but the again, it just seems to be an error and a mistake. And what it will mean is that foreign language teaching will increasingly be concentrated in independent schools, and that foreign language departments will close down in our universities. Nottingham University signalled the closure of its foreign language department,
That's
I think,
tragic.
just this week. And I suspect or hope that is not what she wanted or intended, but the reason for it is that the GCSE mechanism that encouraged the study of foreign languages, the EBAC, was something that was associated in the union's mind and in the education establishment's mind with fusty old elitism, so it had to go. This week we saw a masterclass in how to respond to an interview. It came not from a politician, but from an actress, Sydney Sweeney. Sydney Sweeney, of course, was the object of an enormous amount of attention for lots of reasons over the course of the last year, but none more so than when she was advertising denim trousers. And she talked about her own great genes. Now, there were a number of people, as we've remarked on in this podcast before, who thought that this was some sort of white supremacist coded appeal to the MAGA base to get inside her trousers, as it were. Sydney Sweeney herself remained serenely and masterfully silent about that. She was confronted this week by an interviewer who was trying to get her to apologise for this, as I say, Ku Klux Klan Confederate-style advertising trope. And she rather majestically said, I think that when I have an issue that I want to speak about, people will hear. Maddie, should we admire Sydney Sweeney's refusal to be drawn on this?
Yes, I think absolutely. It's definitely possible to kind of overanalyze what had happened. And there are definitely some people on the right in particular who are sort of, I think, imposing everything that they believe onto this one beautiful young woman who actually has not spoken about her politics ever, which is significant. But to me, I felt that it was really breaking a long-standing tradition in Hollywood where there is almost a kind of compulsion on actors to express opinions on everything, but not every opinion, because the only opinions that one can express are a sort of reheated, identikit, mushy liberalism. And the interviewer was trying hard to get her to open up. And she just refused. And I admire that, because she's saying, as well as not everyone has to be political. People are fed up with being lectured to by celebrities, and it never works. It never works in elections. It just makes, if anything, I think it helps whatever cause they're speaking out against. I'm not going to be drawn. I'm not going to express my opinion. I'm going to stay in my lane and be an actor. And, you know, this has been parodied for many years. I mean, Team America did a remarkable job of it in 2004, and it seems like they've learnt nothing from the experience.
I think that's the majestic thing about it, that she recognised that if she responded, she was going to be drawn into a long conversation about whether or not she was MAGA, whether or not the pun on genes as in denim or genes as in genetics was deliberately contrived in such a way as to send a coded message to the right, and so on. And she rose above it. And I think that the refusal to be pinned down and pigeonholed in that way is admirable. And also her facial expression was far more eloquent than anything she could have said. Well,
it's now spawned like thousands and thousands and thousands of memes. I think it will still be memed about in 5 years' time. It does seem to have made a cultural impact, this interview. As well as responding to the thing of celebrities having to opine on everything, there's also been like a phenomenon I've noticed probably in the last decade or so, it really took off, of a general like bad faith in, interpretation of everything that people do. For example, like I'm not surprised that terminally online people gave a bad faith reading to a jeans commercial, because this is something similar happened with Sydney Sweeney a few years ago, where she threw her mother a birthday party, and in the background shared a few pictures from that party on social media. And in the background, I think some members of her family were wearing like spoof MAGA hats. So not actually a MAGA hat, but something that said make 60 great again, because it's her mum's 60th birthday. And the response was like, these people are disgusting. Sydney Sweeney is MAGA, blah, blah, blah. And again, she wasn't drawn on that. She basically refused to weigh in. And I know that that's not like a massive deal. You know, she's not going to come and trash her family. But I feel like even a few years ago in Hollywood, that you would have had people who basically threw their family under the bus at that point and said, I disavow Donald Trump, blah, blah, blah. And I feel like maybe the fact that she feels that she doesn't have to do that, doesn't have to be drawn, shows that we are moving forward a bit. Like maybe we've passed peak woke in Hollywood at least.
I think that's right. There's another dimension to it as well, which is that even though she hasn't actually said anything in her own terms that is conservative or right-wing, she's been celebrated, arguably appropriated, as a right-wing icon. And there are at least sort of three elements. There was a cover of New York Magazine earlier this year that showed the sort of jeunesse dorée of America celebrating Trump's inauguration. And there was a particularly beautiful young woman who was the focus of all eyes. Secondly, on campuses, there was a TikTok craze a month or so ago for sorority women dancing.
MAGA. Yes.
In a very celebratory, patriotic way. And then you have Sydney Sweeney herself. And the key
Who is
thing...
like unbelievably good-looking, has an era-defining rack.
Yes. The key thing is the pulchritudinousness of right-wing women or women associated with right-wing positions. All my life, the assumption had been that right-wing men, Harry Enfield's Tory boy, arguably Alan Bastard or whatever, are 7 different varieties of either dull, repellent or horrid. Whereas now, hotness and being a right-wing woman are now equated, certainly in American culture. Am I right in identifying this trend, or is this merely wish fulfillment on my part?
Well, I think there are studies that suggest that on average, right-leaning people are better looking. I don't know if that there are probably reasons for that.
Certainly true in the Spectator office.
Well, but I think that there may be a reason that's like that. There tends to be better-looking people tend to out-earn less attractive people, which probably has a lot to do with how they're treated and the much more pleasant experience of going through life if you're like a hottie, that probably it does make economic sense, but perhaps that has led, that maybe being more successful is in America at least aligned with voting to the right. I mean, I don't know. That's just one suggestion. I do think we need to be careful about going too far with this. I mean, I really think that J.D. Vance, when he said his thing about childless cat ladies,
oh yes,
really annoyed a lot of not even particularly left-wing women. There's no need for that kind of unpleasantness. Many women haven't married because they haven't met the right guy. They would very much like to get... So I think that some of this kind of... You want to avoid the impression of kind of kicking down and being too triumphalist. I mean, I know obviously MAGA is doing fantastically well, but I think they actually they would be doing even better if they hadn't needlessly annoyed so many women with that statement.
Is there a British Sydney Sweeney? Is there actor, actress, performer, singer, cultural figure who may carry a degree of freight or baggage, not of their own volition, but given to them, as it were, by people on the right, and who occupies a similar position in our culture?
Well, I don't think there is, because part of the reason that Sydney Sweeney is able to say, I'm tapping out of this stupid conversation, it's exhausting looking for white supremacy everywhere, I can't be bothered with this, is partly because of it's an expression of, comes from a greater position of strength in America, where politically so much of this stuff has been avowed and they have voted in a government that was explicitly anti-woke by a tremendous margin. Whereas in Britain, I feel that we haven't had that kind of a shift, and certainly it hasn't found its way. Maybe it's the case, and perhaps this is an overstretch, but in Britain, at least, if there is a political shift, it doesn't find its way into that kind of celebrity culture, which remains overwhelmingly left-wing. And what do you think?
I think it is hard to think of someone. I mean, there are certainly people whose aesthetic is conservative. Like Kristen Scott Thomas. I have no idea what her political views are. And
I would say once a Tory, now like an FBP.
Lib Dem.
Possibly. But I don't know, because she's never talked about her politics.
No, to her credit.
I love her though.
Then someone else who has...
Liz Hurley. She's a Tory.
Liz Hurley
is... the hottest woman of all time.
Yes, you are absolutely right.
Joan Collins, obviously.
Liz Hurley and Joan Collins are Sydney Sweeneys, yes. I was going to say that Claudia Winkleman has cross-class appeal, and no one would know what her political views are. She remains majestically enigmatic on that. But yes, Liz and Joan. Now, the thing, this is perhaps or should be the closing comment, is that both Liz and Joan, like Sydney Sweeney, have a very, strong embonpoint. Do you think that there is a reason why trad men appreciate curves? Or is it a dangerous route to go down to speculate in that territory?
I don't know. I think that trad men probably like all sorts of things. There's also a particular kind of rather waspy patrician woman that also seems to clean up quite well with trad men as well. I definitely think that if and when we have a reform government, we may see more tits and teeth, darling, tits and teeth, There's that kind of panto element, which
there
is
a
actually
panto element.
It's quite American coded. So perhaps that will take us closer. But whether it will have any impact on... It may just cause our celebrities to go into an absolute meltdown, as they have done at many points in the past. But I don't know. I think what Sydney Sweeney did was interesting. And the fact also that the interviewer didn't actually have the confidence to go for the jugular, as she might have done a few years ago. She very tentatively comes to asking about the American Eagle ad, and she does this almost apologetically. But another thing recently, the actress Jennifer Lawrence gave an interview in which she said, I'm just not going to talk about politics anymore. Firstly, because people hate celebrities telling them what to do, how to vote. But secondly, because I don't want it to detract from my art and to needlessly alienate people in a society that is extremely polarised.
Yeah, I think the most powerful thing, actually, is just to acknowledge that people are, or that lots of people are exhausted by this relentless search to validate a celebrity because that celebrity signs up to a particular set of political positions, and just saying, look, I'm not going to go there. That's arguably the most refreshing thing of all. And we can all speculate about the political views of screen icons or cultural mavens, but in a way, silence is the most eloquent statement of all.